Okay, welcome everybody to our annual Kensei lecture, which is hosted by the Center for Buddhist Studies, but is in large part thanks to the Kensei Foundation and all their support over the years here at UC Berkeley. I think this is, I didn't look it up, something like the 17th Kensei lecture. So that's strange. Anyway, so before beginning, I just wanted to call attention to a couple of events. One is tomorrow in the Institute for South Asian Studies, which is just across the way, whatever direction that is, down in the basement. And that will be Brandon Dotson speaking on the Sutra of Limitless Life and its Dunhuang copies, talking about scribal practices and the copying of sutras en masse around Dunhuang. And then, the next week, or March 7th, 8th, is our Shengyan conference on Buddhism and its interlocutors in the Song Dynasty, China. So you're all welcome to attend that as well. We also have a film which hasn't been advertised yet, but I'm going to just mention it. On March 4th, in the PFA, Pao Ching Dorje, who is a Bhutanese film director, is coming and will be screening his film Yak in the Classroom, and then our present postdoc Jetson Delaplanque, who is a specialist in Bhutanese Buddhist history and friends with Pao, will interview him. So that'll be a really nice event down at the PFA. It hasn't hit the website yet, but it's happening. Oh, there's Jetson just coming in. So yeah, please join us for all that. Before I introduce our speaker and we begin our talk, every year we start with a little informal award ceremony for our Kensei Foundation Award for Excellence in Buddhist Studies, which we award each year to an undergraduate who has shown unusual interest and ability in studying Buddhism. So, Anuksha, do you want to come and just stand here and be embarrassed? I'll just read this little paragraph and you can admire her while I do so. Anuksha Ramadan is a double major graduating this spring in a couple months in environmental sciences and ancient Greek and Roman studies, i.e. classics, with a minor in Buddhist studies. As a lover of history, Anuksha got involved in our Buddhist studies program early on after taking a course on Japanese Buddhism in her first year here at Berkeley. And then she quickly gained a passion for the subject and has taken many other classes, particularly with Professor Mark Blum. And this semester, she's actually enrolled in Sanjot's course on the art and archaeology of the Silk Road. Although she tells me she enjoys all aspects of Buddhist studies, she has a particular interest in material remains, especially when it reflects the complexities of local and Buddhist cultures intermingling. Anuksha plans on pursuing, right after graduating, a JD and entering the field of law. But she is especially interested in protecting natural and cultural heritage and hopes to pursue a career in cultural heritage law. So that's kind of cool and touches on this interest in material culture and Buddhism. In her free time, Anuksha enjoys reading, doing martial arts, and being with her two dogs, Donut and Bagel. So congratulations, Anuksha, and thank you for all your hard work. You take that.
Thank you.
This year we have Kevin Vose to speak with us. The He's the Walter G. Mason Associate Professor of Religious Studies at William and Mary. He received his PhD from UVA in 2005 when he studied under Jeffrey Hopkins in particular. Were you his last student?
He retired that spring.
Yeah. So.
Finished with 2 others.
Uh-huh. So yeah. His PhD was on a topic kind of related to tonight, the history of Svatantrika Prasangika Madhyamaka. But his first book was an important one that I use all the time in my graduate seminars, Resurrecting Chandrakirti, Disputes in the Tibetan Creation of the Prasangika, which was published by Wisdom in 2009. And in this study, Vose mounts an ambitious argument, namely that the 7th century Indian Chandrakirti, unanimously held by Tibetans to be the foremost interpreter of Madhyamaka or middle way thought, was largely disregarded by Indian and Tibetan Buddhists alike for centuries after his death. Chandrakirti's approach, Vose argues in this book, was initially deemed too extreme, too relativist, you might say, until it was resurrected and given pride of place atop the Buddhist hierarchies of philosophical schools. Still today, Chandrakirti is the ultimate touchstone for all Tibetan Buddhist philosophers, yet he was not so until the 11th and 12th centuries, a long time, what is that, 400 years after he died. This was a novel and courageous argument for Vose to make in his very first monograph. Yeah, as far as I know, it has largely withstood the test of time. So the questions he raised in this surprising first book led Kevin deeper into a new and important collection of texts stemming from the early Kadampa tradition. These texts were long thought lost, but then they were rediscovered around the turn of the millennium, around 2000 or something, in the 5th Dalai Lama's personal library at Drepung Monastery, the traditional home of the Dalai Lamas in central Tibet. The resulting collection of early Kadampa materials was published gradually between 2006 and 2015, finally consisting of some 120 volumes, a sort of crazy, huge amount of amazing texts. Taken as a whole, the collection offers countless invaluable windows into the early formation of Tibetan Buddhist scholasticism. Through these newly discovered materials, we can see Tibetan philosophy, among other things, in the making. And this is where Vose's recent research has been focused and what he's speaking about today. So Vose has since established himself as a top expert in these extraordinary new materials. The Austrian Academy of Sciences is one center for much of the research, and Kevin has been an important part of that group. He's worked closely with Pascal Hugon, for example, and they are preparing an edition and translation of Gyalmarwa's Essence of the Middle Way, or I guess Ume Tekonyanyi, published on the website, I noticed today, sort of in raw form on the website of the Austrian Academy of Sciences. So, but stepping back for a moment, I just want to say that part of what makes Kevin's work so unusual in my view is his ability to combine philosophy and history. So Tibetan Buddhist studies has many well-known scholars of Buddhist philosophy who take Buddhist thought seriously as philosophy. And at the same time, on the other side, there are Tibetan historians who concern themselves primarily with things like clan and institutional histories and so on, but leave aside the intricacies of Buddhist doctrine. Vose combines both approaches, narrating a history of Buddhist philosophy that at once takes it seriously as an active mode of philosophical inquiry and understands it as an evolving series of responses to real or literary encounters between actual Indian and Tibetan scholars. So an excellent example of all this is Kevin's new forthcoming book, Splitting the Middle, which promises a history of the Svatantrika versus Prasangika divide, which is kind of the fine-tuning the smallest differences in the highest view for many Tibetans. Here, Kevin shows how the nature of this divide developed gradually and was never the same from one thinker to the next. But this is the subject of tonight's talk, and I don't want to ruin the surprise. So suffice it to say, Bose is a true scholar of vision and creativity within his field, and I'm really very happy to welcome him to deliver this year's Kensei Lecture.
Well, thank you, Jake. I appreciate that overly kind introduction, and really coming from one of our generation's great scholars of things Tibetan. It's humbling. And thank you also for inviting me here to speak to this terrific collection of scholars. It's Berkeley being one of the great places to study Buddhism really in the world. And thank you to the Kensei Foundation for sponsoring this talk and for promoting all the academic study of Tibetan Buddhism that they do. And also thanks to everyone for coming out in an atmospheric river. It's not easy to get around, as we've been learning, to hear about the first Prasangikas. So to begin, I just want to comment, this collection of texts that was discovered at the Drepung Monastery's Arhats Temple of the 16 Arhats, is really among the most exciting developments in the study of Tibetan Buddhism of the past 20 or odd years. We have access now for the first time to texts compiled there from many lineages of Tibetan Buddhism, from Jonang, Kagyu, Kadampa schools. Some of the only versions of these texts that we now possess. And we wouldn't have access to them but for the Peltzek Research Center for Old Tibetan Texts, who has done the heroic work of going into this library, and you can see some of the pictures that they've posted. The job to begin was to just put the text back together, the pages just strewn into piles, and then gradually to reproduce these texts in thematic collections. So some of their collections will concern lineages, some genres of work. So these collections really will have the potential for revolutionizing our understanding of Tibetan religion and intellectual history. The work is slow going, but I think we'll in time get there. And so one of those collections, they titled The Collected Works of the Kadampas, brings together now 120 volumes that provides just a wealth of literature from what in the day, from the 11th to 13th century, was really the center of all things Buddhist philosophy in Tibet. And here I just give a folio sample. In addition to making these manuscripts available, you can perhaps see all the tiny little notes that somebody has scribbled in the margins, between lines, at the bottoms of pages, tops of pages, that give us all sorts of insight into how Buddhist thinking was taught in these centuries. So Kadampa scholars really, as I say, held a monopoly on certain topics, the study of the Middle Way and Buddhist epistemology to be particular, such that Sakya thinkers and Kagyu thinkers would often learn these from Kadampa teachers. So one question looming in the background of a collection like this is why it was assembled in the first place. We know that during the time of the fifth Dalai Lama, that part of the Ganden Podrong's consolidation of power was to convert many monasteries to Gelugpa. We hear stories also of printing blocks from scholars who either were critical of or criticized by the omniscient Tsongkhapa being impounded. And so the people who put this library together often used a little notation on the volumes to indicate whether they came from inside Drepung, which they would mark Nang, or outside of Drepung, which they would mark Chi. So the question could be that the books they took from outside, that came from outside, were in a sense being taken off the market, taken out of circulation, that they were effectively banning them. Or another option, which might be more intellectually defensible, if maybe not morally defensible for stealing people's books, is that they simply wanted to read them. On this line of thinking, perhaps we can ask, did they like what they read? Did the ideas that they found in early Kadampa texts support Gelugpa ideas, or did they find them actually to undermine Gelugpa ideas? So I think probably likely there are a host of ranges. I mean, the collection is so vast that there must be many reasons for this collection, these volumes to have been taken from elsewhere and assembled here. And here, just one more comment to say, we know that a great deal of Tibetan literature exhibits one of the characteristic features of scholasticism, which is a great indebtedness to the past, and that one doesn't criticize the masters of one's tradition. So a Gelugpa scholar does not criticize Tsongkhapa even when they know his thinking on certain topics is problematic. Instead, they spell out what the master must have been thinking. And with these people, though, the Kadampas that I'm going to talk about, these are, in short, nobody's daddy. Nobody has to pretend that they're the authorities. And so the kinds of opinions you get on them from later scholars really it quite varies. They can be critical, they can agree, they can disagree. And as they're taken out of circulation, you see some misrepresentations, liberties taken, I guess we should say, with how they're represented. So crucially for my talk today, the collected works of the Kadampas contain texts for the first time by some of the first supporters of Chandrakirti's interpretation of Madhyamaka. So Chandrakirti's Prasangika view, as it came to be known, was taken by most Tibetans as the highest understanding of the Buddha's exoteric definitive sutras. Tibetan scholars present Chandrakirti's superiority as a historical fact, claiming that he refuted his rival Bhavaveka's Swatantrika interpretation of Madhyamaka, forevermore establishing Prasangika to be the Buddha's final word. This refutation, however, did not seem to capture the attention of Indian Buddhist authors, who largely ignored Chandrakirti for centuries. Nor did it figure into the first Tibetan Buddhist thinking. Yeshe De, for instance, the author of an early Tibetan doxography, is unaware of Chandrakirti or anything called Prasangika. So perhaps it's a tree falling in the forest sort of question. If Chandrakirti argued against his rivals and no one was around to hear it, did he really refute them? Rather, the earliest Tibetan figures, or earliest figures to systematically promote Chandrakirti, were largely Tibetan and composed texts in the 12th century. So these I call the first Prasangikas. We've long known that Patsap Nimadrop translated Chandrakirti's two most significant works, the Madhyamaka Avatara Bhashya and the Prasanna Pada commentary on Nagarjuna's Mula Madhyamaka Karaka. But knowledge that Patsap himself wrote his own commentary on Nagarjuna's treatise, which is the oldest known Tibetan commentary on it, and a further difficult points commentary on the Prasanna Pada, which is the oldest known commentary on that text in any language, seems to have slipped from historical memory. Patsap's compositions are not even mentioned in rare books lists from Tibetan scholars. And yet, here they sat in this library in Drepung Monastery. We now have texts from three of Patsap's disciples. Shang Tangsakpa, who wrote the first complete commentary on the Prasanna Pada, a text discovered by Leonard van der Kuyp in the Tibetan Library of Beijing's Cultural Palace of Nationalities. The collected works of the Kadampas made available Kutun Dedun Bar's Madhyamaka treatise, which contains a substantial discussion of the differences between Prasangikas and Swatantrikas. We get also Mapcha Changjup Sindru's independent Madhyamaka treatise, which fleshes out his long available commentary on the Mula. And to these figures, we must add Jayanand, a Kashmiri who traveled through Tibet and worked with all of these Tibetans before writing a monumental commentary on Chandrakirti's Madhyamaka Avatara in the Tangut kingdom. So these collectively I take to be the first Prasangikas. The collected works of the Kadampas also gives us a wealth of texts from some of Chandrakirti's rare critics. For centuries, authors disinclined to agree with Chandrakirti seem to have ignored him. In 12th century Tibet, Patsap and company were successful enough in promoting Chandrakirti's views to provoke a brief response from Gyalmarwa Jangchupjak and a substantial response from Chaba Choki Senge. Both stand in the lineage of Ngoklot Sawa, who established the premier teaching academy at Sangpu Monastery in central Tibet. So these I take to be the first Swatantrikas, those identifying themselves in response to a Chandrakirti view. And all of these Tibetan figures, Prasangikas and Swatantrikas alike, were affiliated with the Kadampa order. This divide between Prasangikas and Swatantrikas, however, quickly spread. The second and third Sakya hierarchs, the brothers Sonam Semo and Drakpa Gyaltsen, refer to it. The former studied with Chaba Choki Senge and unsurprisingly writes approvingly of Swatantrika perspectives. The first Karmapa is reported to have studied with Patsap and with Gyalmarwa and Chaba. In any case, this divide became part and parcel of most Tibetan scholars' presentations of Madhyamaka, this difference between Swatantrika and Prasangika. To grossly oversimplify, Kagyu and Sakya scholars tend to portray the issue as a difference of logic, that Chandrakirti offered a better way to prove the central Madhyamaka claim that all things are empty. Gelugpas, on the other hand, hold that the logical issues portend a deeper distinction. Chandrakirti and his followers argue the way they do because they actually understand emptiness correctly. Swatantrikas do not. When we turn to the first Prasangikas, it'll be clear that they too see Chandrakirti to offer a singularly correct understanding of emptiness. However, their vision of emptiness and its implications for how one proceeds along the Mahayana path do not at all support the Gelugpa conclusions. So some may be very well familiar with this already, but for those who aren't, just a quick brief introduction. Where does all this debate stem from? It stems from a debate from Nagarjuna declaring that things do not arise from themselves, or from other things, or from both self and other, or without cause. More precisely, the debate stems from how to prove that this is true. Nagarjuna himself offers no argument. Perhaps many people feel no argument is required, that things come from themselves. It seems obviously wrong, and I won't try to convince you that it isn't. But I will just quickly say that things arising from themselves is code word for the Sankhya, the non-Buddhist Sankhya school's doctrine that effects exist in their causes. In short, this is a Sankhya belief that the only way to explain causal regularity, the fact that oak trees always come from acorns, suggests to them that those effects must exist in latent form in their causes already. And to prove Nagarjuna's denial of this claim, an early commentator, Buddhapalita, argued that things don't arise from themselves because their arising would be pointless and without end. What would be the point of arising if the thing supposedly arising already exists? Or if there are a need for something that already exists to arise again, would not the same need still pertain to the newly arisen thing? Bhaviveka, while of course agreeing with the conclusion that things don't arise from themselves, felt this was not a very good argument. It didn't, he claimed, offer a reason. We might point out that Buddhapalita did offer a reason. That's what because here signals. But herein lies the rub. Buddhapalita's reason is expressed as a prasanga, a consequence, an unacceptable outflow of the Sankhya claim. If things did arise from themselves, these absurd points would eventuate. Arguments by prasanga are well known in Indian logic, where they're broadly thought to be effective at disputing an opponent's claim, but to be fairly useless in proving one's own claim. And without going too far into the intricacies of Bhaviveka's criticisms, that's essentially his point, that Buddhapalita has not offered a reason that proves Nagarjuna's claim. Bhavaveka does so using a form of argumentation canonized by the logician Dignaga, inference for the sake of another, in which one is to offer a thesis, reason, and example. So Bhavaveka argues, the inner sense spheres do not arise from self because they exist like consciousness. For Dignaga and Bhavaveka, a reason must be a property of the subject of the argument. So this is to say, the sense spheres exist. And the reason must logically entail the property of the predicate. So existing would entail things not arising from self. And these logical requirements must be verifiable by both the proponent who forms the argument and the opponent whose views in this case are under attack. So both Bhavaveka and the Samkhya opponent accept that the sense spheres exist. Both ought to accept that this reason existing entails not arising from self. The example consciousness, in this case Chaitanya, is a case where both parties accept the entailment. In Samkhya, consciousness is the unchanging nature of an eternal spirit, or Purusha. It exists but does not arise from self or anything else. As the Samkhya in this case accepts that an existing thing does not arise from self, the argument goes, so too they should accept the entailment in the case of the senses. So I don't want to dwell on how good an argument this is, but just want to point out the formal features. It offers a Dignaga-approved reason and example. Chandrakirti defended Buddhapalita's prasanga logical method and attacked Bhavaveka's use of Dignaga-style inference, calling the latter swatantra. Bhavaveka himself used this term swatantra a handful of times in his commentary to Nagarjuna's opus, mainly to distinguish cases in which Nagarjuna argued in support of his own position from cases in which Nagarjuna argued against the views of his opponent. Chandrakirti applies this label to Bhavaveka's inferential argument against Samkhya, which, just to underscore, is an argument against an opponent. Chandrakirti stated, it's not reasonable for Madhyamakas themselves to compose swatantra inferences due to not asserting other positions. He links this contention with Nagarjuna's famous denial of having a thesis, and Aryadeva's almost famous denial of having any philosophical position. The first Prasangikas will take this as a programmatic statement and will unpack the expressions swatantra inference and thesis. But to remain with Chandrakirti just a few moments longer, it's worth pointing out that Chandrakirti must have an understanding of swatantra inference that differs slightly from Bhavaveka's. Both broadly use the expression to designate an inferential argument that supports one's own contentions. But for Chandrakirti, one's own contentions include refuting other people, which is sort of strange. And so to explain, swatantra for Chandrakirti points to the structure of the inference, not simply the role an inference plays. The contrast with his own chosen form of logic makes this clear. A prasanga uses a valid logical entailment to show that an opponent's claim would lead to absurdities. As Bhavaveka suggests, and Chandrakirti spells out, Buddhapalita's argument that things do not arise from themselves could also be expressed as things arising is pointless and endless because, according to you, they arise from self. Buddhapalita's argument hinges on a valid entailment. Arising from self would entail senseless arising, but his reason is not a property of the subject for Buddhapalita. Things arising from self is just what he aims to disprove. His argument then lacks this first characteristic of a valid reason. And this is the issue that Chandrakirti's logical distinction hinges on. A swatantra inference have that first characteristic, while prasanga arguments lack it. For Bhavaveka, all valid arguments fit Dignaga's mold. They can be used either to prove one's case, in which case they would be a swatantra inference, or to disprove an opponent. For Chandrakirti, however, all Dignaga-style inferences are called swatantra. The very thing that Bhavaveka complained about in Buddhapalita's argument, not having a Dignaga-approved reason, is what Chandrakirti takes as its saving grace. But why wouldn't we want logical reasons to be properties of the things they attempt to prove? Chandrakirti's immediate reason, as we saw earlier, is his claim that Madhyamakas simply have nothing to prove. But again, this seems strange. Don't they at least need to prove that their opponents are wrong to claim that things are empty? Or to claim that things are not empty. So we need to probe just one more piece of Chandrakirti's claims to set up his Tibetan champions. Chandrakirti points to Dignaga's dictum that the subject of a debate must be established for both parties to it. And crucially, he rejects that this would be possible when a Madhyamaka debates anyone else. For an opponent, whatever the topic might be, that thing would exist substantially, while for the Madhyamaka, it would exist only imputedly. It would not truly exist. But why would the two parties need to agree on how the subject is established? Shouldn't it be enough that the two sides simply acknowledge the topic, it being the job of the argument to determine whether it has or lacks intrinsic nature? And wouldn't the Madhyamaka accept all sorts of conventional things? This, in fact, is how Bhavaveka saw it. Chandrakirti, however, rejects that the subject might be established for both parties in a pre-reflective sense, without regard for either side's philosophical positions. He claims that when one negates arising, the subject constituted only by mistake deteriorates due to this negation. One who realizes things do not arise from self, other, both, or neither, overcomes the mistaken belief in things, like the inner sense spheres. The subject, then, would already be unestablished for the Madhyamaka, and should the logic be convincing, will become unestablished for the opponent. So this means that Dignaga's first criterion cannot be met. The reason's not a property of the subject because the subject has disappeared. Chandrakirti tells us mistaken and unmistaken are different. Once a Madhyamaka overcomes the mistake that constitutes the subject, which would occur prior to demonstrating this to someone else, then that could, then that subject would not be available to the Madhyamaka as it would be to the opponent. So we can notice here that Chandrakirti moves from consideration to how the subject is established, conventionally or ultimately, to a concern with how the subject appears. He claims that even when we set aside concerns with the conventional establishment of a subject, substantially or imputedly, the mistaken appearance of the subject to the opponent still prevents it from being shared. His rejection of this pre-reflective sense, owing to the difference between erroneous and true seeing, plays on the multiple senses of samvritti, the word we usually translate as conventional. So rather than a conventional establishment, he points us to obscuring vision. An obscurational subject disappears for one whose eye of wisdom has been purified, yet it remains for those who have yet to understand the subject's emptiness. So if we can take this as a second reason for why Chandrakirti says Madhyamakas cannot use Swatantra inference, we see that while he never really spelled out what he meant by this expression, it amounts to inference as Dignaga canonized it, and contradicts two pieces of what Chandrakirti takes to be the Madhyamaka view. Madhyamakas do not use Swatantra inference because they have no theses, and because things do not appear in common to Madhyamakas and others. The second reason can fairly be said to say something important about the implications of emptiness. Realization of emptiness does not leave empty things in its wake. Things no longer appear to the realized. Could this be evidence that Chandrakirti and Bhavaveka, inference lover that he is, in fact understand emptiness differently? It does not seem that Chandrakirti thought so. In fact, he appeals to Bhavaveka's own discussion of the yogi's eye of wisdom, to which the arising of things does not appear, to persuade the latter that the use of inference in these contexts is unwarranted. He would hold, we all know emptiness undermines ordinary things, Yet Dignaga-style inference requires these things. The only option then is to give up on inference in favor of arguments by consequences. So it's Chandrakirti's 12th century supporters who argue for his distinctive and superior understanding of emptiness, after centuries of Madhyamakas, in fact, ignoring his call to abandon inference. Those Madhyamakas, people like in the Indian tradition, Avalokitavrata, Sri Gupta, Gyanagarbha, Shantarakshita, Kamalashila, really the most important figures of the Indian Madhyamaka tradition in these centuries, all those people they label Swatantrikas. Patsap and Kutan call themselves Prasangikas, while Jayananda and Shangtang Sakpa simply call themselves Madhyamakas. The implication being that Swatantrikas aren't really Madhyamakas. Patsap attributes his perspective to his Kashmiri teacher Mahasumati. It's possible then that this distinction between Swatantrika and Prasangika was made in Kashmir just prior to its Tibetan creation. In any case, these are the first to make this distinction in written form and to valorize Chandrakirti's version of emptiness as constituting a higher form of the middle way than that put forward by Swatantrikas. Where Chandrakirti argued, unsuccessfully it seems, against importing Dignaga's logic and epistemology into the Madhyamaka program, his 12th century supporters attacked a pramana-infused Madhyamaka tradition that had been established in Tibet for centuries, and due in part to the efforts of Ngoklotsawa, was thriving when Patsap himself returned to Tibet from Kashmir with his hot new translations of Chandrakirti's texts sometime after the year 1100. Their ultimate success wrested authority from Shantarakshita's Madhyamaka that was built on Swatantra inference. Prasangikas advanced this claim of a higher understanding of emptiness by explicating each of the three pieces of Chandrakirti's critique: the meaning of Swatantra inference, the rationale behind disavowing a thesis, and the counterintuitive assertion that Madhyamakas do not see the same things the rest of us see. They will also connect some dots in Chandrakirti's wider corpus to argue that the choice of logical form, inference or consequences, has great bearing on the Mahayana Buddhist path. And so I'll talk about each of these points in turn. So as translator of Chandrakirti's Prasanapada, Patsap was well familiar with Chandrakirti's criticisms of Bhavaveka. Patsap's commentaries both explicate this critique and expand it to the perspectives of Shantarakshita and Kamalashila, whose views constitute his primary target. While his Nagarjuna commentary will go chapter by chapter through that work, he dwells most extensively on its first chapter, and there offers a lengthy discussion of just what's wrong with Swatantrika. He first answers a more basic question, explaining just what a Swatantra inference is, notably making the expression a technical term. He explains Swatantra as an inference that establishes one's own assertions by way of an inferential subject, reason and entailments that are established by valid cognition. What Chandrakirti implies, Patsap makes overt. We speak here of any inference conceived of in Dignaga's terms, now updated to take in Dharmakirti's advancements. Patsap speaks of Dharmakirti's three classes of reasons as subtypes of Swatantra inference. He further offers an etymology of this expression, Swatantra. Swa refers to the proponent, while Tantra speaks to dependence. That which is dependent is the inference. And so a proponent-dependent inference, an inference that could depend on the proponent, who would use it to advance a position. On the other hand, an inference could depend on the opponent's position, which the inference would attempt to refute. The former here is a Swatantra inference, while the latter would not be. But like Chandrakirti, logic that refutes an opponent will take a different form than Dignaga or Dharmakirti imagined. Patsap will take each of these pieces, the subject, reason, and entailments, in turn to show why emptiness cannot be proved by inference. Where Chandrakirti distinguished Swatantra inference from prasanga logic on whether or not the reason could be a property of the subject, Patsap will argue that all three of Dignaga's characteristics of a valid reason will be lacking when emptiness is at stake. He will go piece by piece through the Swatantra argument, which itself sounds a lot like Shantarakshita. So this is a big chunk here, but bear with me. The reason, as this is our Swatantrika speaking, the mere elimination of one and many is established by conventional valid cognition, perception and so forth, in a subject that is merely just what appears, without being qualified in any way, but established by conventional valid cognition. The entailment is made in terms of any basis that real existence entails a real one or many. By negating a real one or many, in mere appearance, a real nature is negated, through which naturelessness is established. Or, to put it more simply, the inference, appearances lack intrinsic nature because they're neither one nor many, which is quite similar to how Shantarakshita's Madhyamaka Alankara begins. Shantarakshita in that text will go on to say how both imaginary and everyday entities are not single and not many. So Patsap then will go through both these options that Shantarakshita discusses, imaginary things and everyday things, and will argue that neither one is an appropriate venue for a Swatantra inference. And this in turn touches on a key debate in the Dharmakirti tradition on whether inference can operate on imaginary things. To briefly encapsulate, Dharmakirti's interpreters engage in lengthy debates concerning whether non-existent things can be proper subjects of inference. The Buddhist wishes to prove to non-Buddhists that all sorts of things those non-Buddhists believe to exist, like a creator God and an internal spirit, do not in fact exist. And so inference might seem to be the tool for that job. However, a valid reason must be the property of the inferential subject. Some interpreters then see inference to be impossible when an imaginary thing is the topic. Imaginary things have no properties. Given that for a Buddhist, a creator God does not exist, one can't speak about the characteristics of such a God. In the same way, it makes no sense to talk about the length or color of a horse's horn. Other interpreters, however, hold that non-existent things do have at least one property, namely the property of not existing. And to this, we could add further negative properties. A creator God is not impermanent and cannot cause effects. In this reading, so long as an inference utilizes absolute negations for reasons, the inference can be valid. Patsap, however, argues that neither kind of subject, real or imaginary, will produce a valid inference. He summarily rejects the possibility that imaginary things could serve as a subject, pointing out that such things can't be validly established. So this undermines the requirement that an inferential reason be a property of the subject, and so valid cognition would not be able to know the subject having its reason. Citing Dharmakirti as his authority, he concludes valid inference could not be produced. He concludes, in agreement with some in the Dharmakirti tradition, that imaginary things are the domain of prasanga logic. Patsap devotes deeper consideration to the seemingly unproblematic practice of taking entities that appear to our senses as inferential subjects. Rather than place the subject on solid footing, Patsap sees shared consent as simply pointing to shared ignorance, claiming that ordinary appearances are not appearances to valid cognition, but false appearances held in common by mistaken cognitions. To support his claim, he winds through a variety of Buddhist theories of perception, arguing that in all cases, none of these theories can adequately explain how an external object comes to be the object of an internal cognition. So these are, in short, a great deal of analysis that Patsap engages in, which would seem to go against his opponent, the Swatantrika, who speaks to just appearances, appearances to the senses without consideration of any school's philosophy. Patsap, though, would take the fundamental conflict between valid cognition and human error as what he wishes to emphasize. The Swatantrika wants conventional valid cognition to know the subject, while some higher-powered cognition knows its emptiness. Patzap sees no way to distinguish levels of valid cognition. Either the perception of the everyday thing is valid, or the inference of its emptiness is valid. You can't have, as he would say, both. For Patzap further, all human cognitions are, to use this expression one sees a great deal in Indian texts, are of limited vision, which is to say, in Patzap's mind, they are invalid. So the result then is that perceptible objects are no more real for Patzap than imaginary things like creator gods. Therefore, both, he feels, are the proper domain for prasanga reasoning. So this is a great unpacking of what Chandrakirti has already said, that prasanga operates with an argument in which that first characteristic that Dignaga spoke of is not there. However, Chandrakirti never questioned the logical entailments of an inference, as those are also required for prasanga arguments. Patzap extends his critique to all three characteristics of a valid reason. The logical entailments of the neither one nor many argument he rejects on the grounds that the bases of these entailments would have to be real things. He sees in the Swatantrika's attempt to establish the entailment between neither one nor many and naturelessness a violation of the Madhyamaka code. As he puts it, if you say such an entailment is established, your Madhyamaka assertions deteriorate, because you assert that all phenomena are natureless. But any basis in which that entailment is established itself is established as having a real nature. So the Swatantrika has told us that the entailment between real nature and being a real one or many could be established in any basis, in any object. But to a Madhyamaka, the entailment can't be established in any object. There simply are no real things one could point to as being a real one or a real many. So in purporting to establish this relationship, the Swatantrika would have to accept at least some real things. Not everything would be empty of intrinsic nature. So the only option then is for the Madhyamaka to use prasanga arguments, in which the logical relations only need be accepted by the opponent. This expression, found in Chandrakirti too, becomes a term of art for prasangakas who speak of opponent-accepted inference, in which the three characteristics of validity stem only from the opponent's assertions. Buddhapalita and Chandrakirti already showed how this would be so for the first characteristic. The Sankhya claim that things arise from themselves is a statement of the reason being a property of the subject for the Sankhya opponent. Patzap discusses several ways that entailments too can be thought of as just what the opponent claims. One is quite simple. Someone might say that everywhere there are cows, horses will be found. Why somebody would say that, he doesn't tell us. He may have in mind some sort of herding culture, I'm not sure. In any case, this relationship is just somebody's assertion, not verified in reality. That entailment might in fact be disproved by pointing to a place where one sees cows but no horses. The way Patzap would do that would be to say, in a cow-filled, horseless place, there are horses because there are cows. The opponent would then either have to accept that there must be horses in a horse-free place, or give up on the horse-cow entailment. Some contemporary interpreters say this is how prasanga logic works. It points out two internally contradictory beliefs and leaves it up to the opponent to figure out which one must be relinquished. It establishes nothing about how things really are. But there's another possibility for how an entailment might be just an opponent's assertion. Patzap suggests this, and his student Kutun gives structure to it. We can understand prasanga logic to operate simply on what must stem from an opponent's false claim. The Sankhya opponent claims that things arise from themselves, and so now, by logical entailment, must come to accept that the arising of such things would be pointless and endless. Here, opponent accepted speaks to the logical antecedent and to the outflow. The opponent accepts the former and must accept the latter. The Madhyamaka accepts neither one. Logical entailment, however, operates as expected. It's not just something that the opponent makes up. So Patsap and Kuton will agree the opponent will be forced to give up on their core belief. Accepting that the arising of things is senseless and endless is simply not an option. So in this case, this opponent-accepted form that he's proposing, that Prasangakas are proposing, are meant to be a direct counter to how they understand Swatantra inference. Emptiness, they'll argue, requires this latter form. It won't work with Swatantra. So I want to turn now to how early Prasangakas read Nagarjuna's and Chandrakirti's claims to have no thesis or position. Somewhat surprisingly, this takes us out of the intricacies of logic and into the world of mental states. In arguing that Swatantra inference cannot be used by Madhyamakas because they do not assert other positions, Chandrakirti would seem by context to refer to the other options that Nagarjuna rejected concerning how things might arise. A Swatantra inference might be warranted, he suggests, if Madhyamakas asserted that things arise from other things. But since Nagarjuna ruled out that too, arising from self and other, and causeless arising, Madhyamakas have no other positions to prove. And again, he quoted there Nagarjuna's denial of a thesis. However, Chandrakirti himself calls Nagarjuna's claims that things don't arise from self, other, both, or causelessly, theses. Clearly, Chandrakirti had some kind of implicit criteria for bad theses that Madhyamakas do not have, such that they could still have some kind of unproblematic thesis. Early Prasangakas called these latter mere theses. This term mere or tsam serves to delimit, here to restrict okay theses from certain fully qualified theses that their opponents would use. Nagarjuna's and Chandrakirti's are just theses, whereas their rivals hold on to something more pernicious. Shangtang Sakpa explicitly identified problematic theses with Dignaga, and Dignaga's stipulation that a valid thesis be intended by oneself. For Shang, Swatantra, at least in part, serves as a gloss on this of Dignaga's dictum. Madhyamakas have no Dignaga-approved thesis. They do not intend to prove that things lack intrinsic nature. And Shang will go on to tell us that in using Swatantra inference, people like Bhavaveka, Gyanagarbha, Shantarakshana, and Kamalashila are not really Madhyamakas, or followers of Nagarjuna. Patsap speaks to the Dharmakirti stipulation that a valid thesis have a subject that one desires to know. One might desire to know whether a distant hill has fire, in the classic example, but here the Madhyamaka does not desire to know whether things are empty. These appeals to technical discussions in inferential theory serve a bigger purpose. Our Prasangakas hold that not only can emptiness not take its place in the thesis of an inference, it cannot form the content of human knowledge. More specifically, Patsap says that emptiness cannot be the object of positive determination or elimination. Now, both of these positive determination and elimination bear logical and epistemological valences. Prasangakas highlight, though, the mental side. Broadly speaking, to positively determine something is to know that thing exists. To eliminate something is to know that thing does not exist, at least in a particular context. A single moment of cognition might do both. It might positively determine the presence of a microphone on a podium and eliminate the existence of all other things in that same spot. Put in terms central to Madhyamaka, one might eliminate things' intrinsic nature and at the same time positively determine that things are natureless, which, just to say, was Tsongkhapa's claim. For Tibetan Madhyamakas wedded to the epistemological tradition around this time, those that Patsap would call Swatantrikas, these did not form two sides of the same coin. You could have one without the other. Most crucially, emptiness for them was not positively determined, but was only the object of elimination. So Patsap Swatantrika phrases this way: Although you do not assert a probandum of positive determination, you must assert a probandum of mere eliminative negation. Therefore, you must assert a reason and so forth to establish that. Potsdam answers, no. I don't assert even a probandum of mere negation. Since the nature to be negated is not established, a negation too is not tenable. Emptiness might be thought to be an elimination of a real nature, and that this elimination could be expressed as a thesis, such as all phenomena lack a real nature. A positive determination might know this naturelessness and express it as the positive thesis, all phenomena are natureless. The common assumption that positive determination operates on presence while elimination works on absence suggests right away to figures on both sides of this divide that positive determination simply cannot be involved in emptiness. The mere negation of intrinsic nature, however, would seem to be just what emptiness is. How can Patsap reject this too? In a line of thinking extending from Chandrakirti and through his early Prasangika collaborators, Patsap reasons that since a real nature cannot be established, the negation of it is not established either. No nature is just a label applied to the absence of nature, which never existed to begin with. Intrinsic nature was never truly known. Prasanga reason simply prompts one to relinquish a false belief. So this reading of thesis-lessness goes well beyond what Chandrakirti had to say, but it takes a cue from themes throughout his work, namely that ordinary consciousness has little value on the Mahayana Buddhist path. Early Prasangikas apply this claim to the relationship between arguments and mental states. Jayananda brings this relationship to the foreground of his attacks on Swatantrika. In commenting on a passage of the Madhyamakavatara in which Chandrakirti distinguishes his own illusory logic from the realist assumptions of his opponent, Jayananda envisions a Swatantrika defense of the use of inference to cause new knowledge in an opponent's mind. While many of us might see changing someone's mind as the point of our argument, in Jayananda's discussion, the Swatantrika recognizes the potential to run afoul of Nagarjuna's rejection of arising. Jayananda's Swatantrika distinguishes between Nagarjuna's analysis of cause and effect, things like seeds and sprouts and flames and light, on the one hand, and the knowledge that arises from refuting those things on the other. So he writes, if we were to assert that a cause produces, there would be contradiction in our words. However, because we assert a cause of illumination in the context of refutation and object of refutation, what contradiction could there be? The Swatantrika would attempt to negate a substantialist view of causality and cause knowledge or illumination of that absence of that false view. This would uphold Nagarjuna's rejection of arising, but maintain that Madhyamaka negation results in or causes an opponent's knowledge. In the broader Buddhist view, negations are not produced, but the mental state that becomes aware of negation would seem to be. And this is the Swatantrika's point. So, aside from the obvious problem that Nagarjuna says we simply don't have any version of causality, this would, for Patsap, cause a Swatantrika to fall victim to their own argument. The Swatantrika in this portrayal tries to draw an exegetical line, holding on to the necessity of knowledge being produced through all this negation. Jayananda explains that the Swatantrika's problem lies in asserting a reason that is a functioning thing, characterizing it as a cause of illumination. Reasons, as Swatantrikas conceive of them, are real things, part of the cause and effect world, just as non-Madhyamakas understand them to be. Jayananda advocates instead for Chandrakirti's illusory reason, in which Prasanga logic operates like a mirror to assist a person in beautifying their wisdom face. It removes the dirt of false beliefs. If Swatantrikas instead insist on a Dignaga Dharmakirti reason, those who assert cause and effect functioning things will object to a Madhyamaka's use of causal arguments, in the same way that Madhyamakas themselves deconstruct causality. As Jayananda sees it, Swatantraka's use of this logical system implies their acceptance of a subtle version of arising from other, which Nagarjuna ruled out, in which the reason cause itself would have intrinsic nature. Rather than convince the opponent, this affords the opportunity to turn Swatantraka's own arguments against them. The self-defeating argument fails to cleanse their wisdom face. As Chandrakirti puts it, our logic alone is most beautifying. So theses then are anathema for Madhyamakas because they suggest that emptiness can become the content of propositional knowledge, that one can have a cognition that all things are empty, and that one could produce this knowledge in an opponent's mind. So now just the last piece, how our prasangikas flesh out Chandrakirti's intuition that Swatantra inference fails due to the inability of a Madhyamaka and non-Madhyamaka to perceive the subject of a debate. So we've already heard Patsap arguing that two parties' agreement on an appearing subject only establishes that those two parties possess a shared ignorance. Taking this a step further, he claims that the Swatantraka wish to validly establish an inferential subject transforms supposed mere appearance into real things. Any attempt to establish the subject, even while it's claiming that it's an entity of the measure of appearances, would mean that the subject is apprehended to be real. The problem, as Patsap sees it, is that this is simply what valid cognition does. It's in the business of distinguishing real things from false things. Anything established by valid cognition must be really real. As Patsap puts it, since you engage a real entity that's just established rather than undermined by valid cognition, your middle way that holds to the naturelessness of all things deteriorates. On the other hand, one might take seriously those middle way arguments and conclude with Chandrakirti that inferential subjects are undermined. As Patsap puts it, by negating production, the inferential subject, mistaken appearances, is also negated. And so the inferential subject is not established for you Swatantrakas. Mistaken appearances are apprehended substantially when not analyzed. The unmistaken appears as utterly unestablished when analyzed. So the ordinary things that might be commonly accepted by two parties to a debate are mistakenly cognized as real things. Madhyamaka analysis dispatches this mistaken appearance for the Madhyamaka. The substantial subject deteriorates. This leaves the Madhyamaka with unestablished appearances. So speaking to Chandrakirti's observation that mistaken and unmistaken are different, Patsap understands that the Madhyamaka's unmistaken appearances are simply not shared with a substantialist opponent who believes them to be real. Nonetheless, we might expect that a mere appearance that does not take into account how something appears would still be sufficient for debate purposes. So then Patsap turns to just simple perception as a means for agreeing on something we can argue about. However, of course, this too is not going to work. He states, since even appearing form has ceased for omniscient wisdom, Chandrakirti stated mistaken and unmistaken are different. In that state of omniscience, a real entity is not seen. So now we're talking about a realized Madhyamaka who sees only the absence that is ultimate truth. So this active immersion in emptiness makes for a very different rationale for the impossibility of a shared inferential subject. No longer is Chandrakirti speaking to what a Madhyamaka knows that distinguishes how things appear. Now it's the very lack of any appearance that prevents common perception. The state of omniscience that those realized Madhyamakas attain suggests that he speaks here of the permanent state of Buddhahood. And this is, in fact, a point that his disciple Shangtang Tsakpa makes clear. So Shangtang Tsakpa says, from the perspective of Swatantrakas, and for us, the inferential subject is a mistaken conventionality. It appears and it's empty of truth. That's what it means to be a conventionality. In a Buddha's perspective, however, the inferential subject is non-existent from the beginning, due to unmistaken omniscience. Whatever appears does so through the force of afflictive and non-afflictive ignorance. Buddhas have neither of the pervading ignorances and so have no capacity for the pervaded appearances. And then using a very common metaphor in Madhyamaka, just like, for example, when one has myodesopsia, which I'm told is the correct medical term for this, although we often just say cataracts, falling hairs appear. But when myodesopsia clears, the appearances cease. When the hairs do not appear, it's not the case that something existent does not appear. They do not appear because their existence is utterly impossible. Similarly, it's not the case that an existent inferential subject does not appear to a Buddha. So that's sort of weird. Buddhas are now being evoked to say why things don't appear in common to a Madhyamaka and a non-Madhyamaka. Swatantrikas in this portrayal know emptiness, and Shang places his own realization on par with theirs. But he and Prasangikas understand the implications of this and so give up on inferential reasoning. In contrast, Buddha's cognitive perfection disallows any kind of appearances. Using the common Madhyamaka example of this eye disease, he emphasizes that ordinary appearances never existed to begin with. Their cessation for Buddhas constitutes Buddhas seeing what's always been the case. So, Madhyamakas don't engage in inferential debate because they know that anything they might debate about doesn't truly exist. Now, Buddhas don't engage in inferential debate because they simply don't see anything to debate about. This raises some questions. Namely, does anyone think that Buddhas actually would engage in debate? Although I suppose the early sutras are full of stories of Buddhas taking on all sorts of comers. But in any case, if Buddhas did engage in debate, would they need to play by Dignaга's rules? And really even more basic, if Buddhas don't actually see anything, how can they complete their Buddha mission to help out the rest of us? This question haunts all of our early Prasangikas with their austere vision of a Buddha's perfection. Chandrakirti points out at the close of his Prasanapada discussion of correct Madhyamaka logic that Dignaga's insistence on reasons established for both parties in a debate runs counter to worldly practice, in which reasons, or in his metaphor, evidence, accepted by oneself will be germane. He's thinking of a court of law. Chandrakirti concludes that this is just what Buddhas do, aiding disciples by way of reasoning that those disciples will accept. Shang's notion that Buddhas would lack any appearance shared with others, because they have no appearances at all, suggests just this perspective, that they use reasoning only established for those whom they lead toward awakening. What's good enough for Buddhas suffices as well for Chandrakirti and his Prasangika followers, who use logic established for their opponents, not because they do not perceive ordinary appearances, but because of their knowledge that emptiness undermines those appearances. So, to sum up what's wrong with inference, in a short, Swatantra inference requires real things and attempts to establish real things, but Madhyamakas know there are no real things. Swatantra inference attempts to make known a thesis, but emptiness cannot be known. Swatantra inference requires intersubjective appearances, but real Madhyamakas see no appearances, and good Madhyamakas know that they will cease. So, this appeal to how Buddhas teach and how Madhyamakas ought to teach gives insight into how early Prasangikas understand the Mahayana path. So if you want to be a Buddha, or a Buddha, you need correct reasoning. Kamalashila's influential model has the reasoned inferential understanding of emptiness to be central to one's cognitive refinement. You first know emptiness through inference. This, after intensive meditation, leads to yogic cognition of emptiness, which gradually leads to omniscience. Prasangika's rejection of inference includes a rejection of inferential knowledge of emptiness. Their logical method, though, is going to serve an analogous position in their reconception of the Mahayana path. We've already heard from Jayananda that Prasanga arguments do not create new knowledge. Patsap argues that consequential logic simply negates the opponent's false claims and thereby eliminates a real nature. In brief, any opponent's view of there being an intrinsic nature of things, whether it's mental things, physical things, imaginary things, would necessitate that those really real things be either singular in nature or multiple. Proceeding very similarly to Shantarakshita's Madhyamaka Alankara, Patsap argues first against singularity. Things being truly singular would have absurd consequences. If one thing moved, everything would move. If one person knows something, everybody would know that thing. So true singularities must be given up. And given that a true multiplicity would require a host of veridical singularities, many also must be relinquished. So setting aside the potency of these arguments against real-life adversaries, the purpose of prasangas is simply to eliminate false belief and point out the non-existence of real things. Real things never existed to begin with, and so the argument neither destroys something existent nor establishes something to be non-existent. And the elimination of these false beliefs does not constitute new knowledge on the opponent's part. Nothing is truly known. Kuton expands on this point. He considers the Swatantrika challenge that elimination of superimpositions itself is the establishment of the ultimate, and therefore would require inference. Kuton counters, the ultimate is the mere elimination of all proliferations such as existence, non-existence, appearance, and truth. It's not established as any entity at all. The reasoning that establishes that is consequences. In effect, the ultimate is what one calls the absence of all false views. Given that consequential arguments eliminate these superimpositions, the same technique can be said to establish the absence that is the ultimate. The ultimate, though, is not established as anything. It's just the absence of all falsity. And so for Kuton, the necessity of consequences to accomplish the elimination of false views enables one to say that negating consequences establish the ultimate, even though nothing is really established. The question of the relationship between arguments and mental states, or lack of mental states, that Chandrakirti raised comes to a finer point in Patsap's analysis of what causes a person to know emptiness. Chandrakirti tells us that Aryas take up reasoning that is known in the world for the sake of the world's ascertainment, in order to induce realization in the world. For Aryas, who've passed beyond mental proliferation, there's only silence. Patsap sees Chandrakirti here offer a method for inducing realization of reality. Patsap's terminology suggests that consequences do in fact give rise to moments of correct cognition in the opponent upon the negation of wrong views. Patsap's consequential method here stakes an alternate model to the standard Buddhist logic, in which one uses inference for other to invoke inference for self in one's debate partner. The opponent's realization then might serve as the basis for intensive contemplation that yields yogic perception, which in turn produces realization of reality. We can turn to Patsap's and Chandrakirti's framing of yogic perception for clues on how to understand the cognitive results of consequences. Chandrakirti argued that there can be no direct perception of emptiness because consciousness would have no object of observation, emptiness being a simple absence of intrinsic nature. With the cessation of its would-be object, consciousness would take the form of this non-object. It would not arise. Since consciousness retains its direct link with its object in the sense that the object's cessation necessitates consciousness's absence, we can call this a case of direct perception even though there's actually no perception. This metaphorical perspective on yogic perception applies to the mental state induced by consequences. Patsap, rejecting the model of inference, understands his reasoning to stop the opponent's wrong view, with the cessation of any objective support, no consciousness of absence can arise. Instead, the reasoning induces only mental absence. Moving further, as the repeated non-perception, that is yogic perception, cleanses the mind of false views, Prasangikas speak of the crucial moment of awakening in similarly metaphorical terms. A key passage comes in comment on Nagarjuna's rhetorical question, if nirvana is neither an entity nor a non-entity, by whom is neither an entity nor a non-entity realized? Chandrakirti and Patsap take this as an investigation into the mental states of one who attains nirvana. Chandrakirti argues that neither consciousness nor wisdom can realize, grasp, or illuminate nirvana. He notes that consciousness cannot take on this task, for it requires a mark or a nimitta as an object of observation, whereas in nirvana there is no mark whatsoever to support it. Wisdom does not know nirvana because it has emptiness as its object of observation and takes the form of non-production and the form of non-existence. The non-existence and non-production of wisdom make it clear that even calling it wisdom and saying that emptiness is its object are, again, only metaphors. The labels can be applied owing to the congruence between the non-existent subject and the absence that is its object. Wisdom comes to be applied to mental absence. So Chandrakirti's answer to Nagarjuna's question is that no one at all realizes that nirvana is neither an entity nor a non-entity. Patsap tells us the one who realizes nirvana is free from extremes. Just as nirvana is free from the four extremes, so too is realization of it free from existence, non-existence, both, and neither. The mutual absence of subject and object, again, expunges any cognitive force from this ultimate realization. So, to sum, Patsap's soteriological model remains consistent throughout. Consequential logic, or prasangas, refute false conceptions, leading to a simple absence of wrong views. Yogic perception is just a label for the direct correspondence between the absence of perception and the emptiness of things. And realizing nirvana simply means the absence of mind that aligns with the absence of all appearance. Patsap places his consequential model, his consequential logic, in a position analogous to inference of emptiness in the standard Madhyamaka model. His consequences aim to stop opponents' wrong conceptions. Rather than causing knowledge of a true state of affairs, they induce mental absence that eventually culminates in the cessation of mind itself. Some see this kind of denial of cognitive language to espouse a kind of skepticism, in which the Madhyamaka rejects any kind of certainty about the way things really are. Patsap's model makes it abundantly clear that his aim is not a skeptical suspension of certainty. His consequential arguments refute opponents' claims and affect the relinquishment of false views. While it's true that if successful, the opponent will come to lack the mental state of certainty concerning the truth of any view, this will be so because the opponent will lack any mental state. Patsap's consequences do not convince the opponent of the futility of seeking certainty, but intend the cessation of certainty itself. This is the subjective side of his anti-establishment contention. With no claims or entities to establish, there can be no ascertainment of those claims or entities. In the end, for him, there would be no mind to be skeptical. Early Prasangikas claim then that one's choice of argumentation, swatantra inference, or arguments by prasangas do not amount to a simple preference or even to the effectiveness of the argument. Chandrakirti challenges the compatibility of Dignaga's inference and Madhyamaka emptiness, but suggests that his understanding of emptiness would be shared by Bhaviveka, and really with any Madhyamaka. But after centuries of Madhyamakas ignoring Chandrakirti's admonition to give up on inference, his 12th century revivers present his chosen form of argument as implicating a higher understanding of emptiness than that maintained by the inference-loving Swatantrikas. So in one sense, the Gelupas are right. Prasangikas, in in this debate have a different understanding of emptiness than Swatantrikas. There's nothing, however, in Chandrakirti or in early Prasangikas to suggest anything like the Gelupa contention that while Swatantra inference cannot be used by Madhyamakas, Dignaga and Dharmakirti style inference can be. As we've seen, Dignaga inference is just what Chandrakirti meant by Swatantra. Dharmakirti inference is just what early Prasangikas meant by it. Further, whether the Prasangika view of emptiness represents a better understanding than Swatantrikas have could be seen as quite problematic. The Prasangika understanding requires significant modifications to the Mahayana Buddhist path. That emptiness implies and impels the absence of mind and mental states makes a coherent model of transformation difficult to sketch. Rather than the elimination of problematic features from consciousness, culminating in a purified omniscient mind, as the Swatantrika model would have it, consciousness itself is left behind. How Buddhas come to be from all this remains puzzling. And given that this is the whole point of the Mahayana path, perhaps we could say that Swatantrikas were onto something. Thank you for your patience. I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you for this talk. I'm curious about the last slide, actually the penultimate slide. You said absence of false views translates to mental cessation. What are the Sanskrit terms for mental cessation and for false views here? I would have expected something like prapancha, but complete mental cessation, that's of course something else.
Yeah, and so this discussion we have of Chandrakirti's coming when he's speaking that neither consciousness nor wisdom would illuminate nirvana. And so that no one at all realizes nirvana is neither an entity nor a non-entity. So the Sanskrit I may have in a footnote. I don't have it at the top of my mind. The expression is, it's a clear discussion in Madhyamaka Avatara Bhashya, which we don't have Sanskrit available to, somebody has it, we don't yet have it, where he's using the expression semtang semtung, so chitta chaita are the things that cease at the moment of this radical transformation.
Yeah. Thank you. So this is just a follow-up on Alex's point. This is a very important point because it seems on the one hand that at least as you describe it here, the Prasanga project is a soteriological project about achieving a certain kind of, whatever you want to call it, state, realizations, the state of the Buddhas or the Aryas. But it's predicated on there being no arising, right? So so the point that Alex is making is that if we talk about Nirodha, it's a completely different thing that we're talking just a cessation of prapancha, or false views. So is that project, is that does it fall out of the logic of the Prasanga? Is that even sort of, conceptually coherent project? Are there sort of tensions within the later Tibetan commentary literature on Chandrakirti that suggests that maybe this is not a defensible position?
Yes, yeah, and so that's what I was trying to get at with Alex's question as well, that you have discussions in all of these authors about, well, where does all this stuff come from? Like we're trying to talk about a Buddha. We know that a Buddha has 3 kayas, or some use a 4-body theory. Where do those bodies come from, if not from purification of mind? But they go again and again to say, but we all know that there is no more mind. And so it's not a case that these things are transformed, and they have to try to work out some kind of other explanation of how these things arise, despite the fact that the thing that we take as consciousness, as the basis of purification, is no more.
Because one of the accusations against Nagarjuna obviously was that he's in some sense undermined the very path, right? I mean, that's one way to read the project. But you're arguing that they figure out ways to reconcile holding it to the Prasanga view, what position, whatever, and at the same time that can serve as a foundation for practice, right? For the very thing that the Madhyamika is supposed to try to achieve.
Yeah, so I mean, and just to say maybe more clearly, I'm saying that they all know it's a problem, and they try to work out solutions, and I don't feel the solutions are very good solutions. And I feel the Swatantrika approach is more successful. I would even go so far as to say that among the reasons why later Tibetan scholars import a Swatantrika leaning position is because they too came to that conclusion that this was a simpler, more straightforward way. And so, I mean, Kamalashila's model is what I think many take as the de facto model.
By the way, this is very interesting, and I have a question kind of out of ignorance, not knowing much about Buddhist philosophy, but I was really interested in the figure of Jayananda as this kind of figure who seems to come in. And you mentioned that, of course, he's from Kashmir, and that he has some kind of, he brings a lot of. So actually, my point is, like, how can we think about this historically with these kind of different pundits coming from different places, and then how do these ideas spread and grow? Do we see them? I'm wondering if we can think about roots and lineages and how we can tie certain figures like this Jayananda from Kashmir, and like how that kind of brings about this kind of renaissance or this kind of new interpretation of Prasangika in certain places. And I was also wondering, since this is like the great time when we get this kind of Shaiva monism in Kashmir, and we get all these kind of polemics against Buddhists in Shaiva literature at this time, do we see his sort of Buddhism? I don't know if there's something you've looked into, that his sort of Buddhism reflected in the Shaiva polemics against Buddhism and their own particular versions of things like consciousness and knowledge of consciousness and yogic consciousness. So I was just curious about this kind of Kashmiri connection.
Yeah, no, I think it's an excellent question. It's something, so again, Patsap attributes his perspectives to his Kashmiri teacher, a man about whom we know next to nothing. Jayananda, Kashmiri, those two in Tibetan literature are often considered the two streams of Chandrakirti's thinking that enter Tibet. Second generation Prasangikas put those streams together. And so they themselves, are thinking of those as different teaching lineages from Kashmir. The question of what might have been going on in Kashmir, I find very fascinating. It's also, when you speak of Shaiva literature, which I know next to nothing, to just point to Patsap's activity as a translator of tantras. And so we know that in addition to these Chandrakirti's Madhyamaka texts, that he translated Guhya Samaja literature as well. And so is it, to getting back, I think, to the first two questions, is what's really implicit here that a sort of divide between consciousness as the likes of us know it and some sort of enlightened consciousness? Enlightened, we often use the expression wisdom instead. And so is Patsap's model, say, based on Chandrakirti, where you negate all problematic features of consciousness ceases, but there's some sort of deeper underlying wisdom that was there all along. Just for instance, I don't know. To me, it's an interesting question when you have, again, a guy who spends his time in Kashmir on Madhyamaka literature and on Guhya Samaja literature. And there's even some thought that probably those texts circulated in Tibet together, like the texts by the Madhyamaka author Chandrakirti and by the Arya Chandrakirti, whom many Buddhists took to be the same person anyway. And so was there some sort of implicit understanding that those two bodies of literature actually compose a coherent whole? But that is it's really just speculation.
Hi, I had a question about Nagarjuna's no thesis. there was on an earlier slide, there was no thesis was equal to no positive determinism, no position. And there was a Tibetan phrase next and a Pali phrase next to that. And I'm just curious about translation from sources in antiquity into terms in modern logic. Do they map neatly into what we call positive determinism, or is that are there things that are lost in translation? Yeah, that's all.
Okay, this is something I know little of, to know whether, in terms of modern logic, and so would, in modern logic, you get the same distinction between mental states that affirm and mental states that deny, that reject? Is that fair to say? Oh, that's your question. Oh, okay. And so that's definitely how the expressions are being used in this literature. That we have one sort of mental operation that essentially affirms the presence of things, and a second mental operation that negates the non-existence of things. And again, many Buddhist authors would say those are just really two sides of the same cognitive coin, but not many of the Madhyamakas here would say, except when we're talking about emptiness. And so emptiness, you couldn't have positive determination of, because there's nothing to affirm. Other Tibetan authors, and so Tsongkhapa being the classic, say that makes no sense. You would know that things are natureless. That would be the positive determination in that case. But I don't know if that gets to your question.
Thank you for this very interesting talk. My question is about your comment that it would be difficult to situate the Prasangika position within traditions of skepticism. And the skeptical reading of the Prasangikas is, of course, a very popular reading, but previous authors who have made that argument aren't drawing in this new body of literature that you have access to. And I'm just wondering to what extent your argument is really grounded in these new sources, or you think that it's clear that, for example, Chandrakirti in the writings we've always had access to, that he's not really any kind of Hellenistic skeptic.
Yeah, thanks. So the new literature, to me, and I should just say that Jayananda's text has been there for a long, long time, and nobody made much use of it. But this literature, I feel, gives a very straightforward reading of Chandrakirti. Whereas many people who put forward a skeptical interpretation are very strongly influenced by the Gelugpa tradition. The Gelugpa reading of Chandrakirti is not very straightforward. And so the question would be, do we think that a convoluted reading of Chandrakirti somehow gets at something in Chandrakirti that the straightforward reading doesn't? I myself say no. That these are straightforward interpreters of Chandrakirti. They're not trying to gloss over the problematic features of his philosophy in the way that later interpreters will. And so I guess it's a long way of saying it, but yeah, I think that the skeptical argument is a contemporary philosophical way of making sense of certain features of the Gelugpa reading of Madhyamaka. I do think it also misses other features of the Gelugpa reading. I think there's no way of reading Madhyamaka to end up with the conclusion that what this is all pointing to is a return to the ordinary world as the focus of that project, which I think many of the skeptical interpreters would want. So that's, yeah, I don't know if that answers your question. So I would say partially predicated on this new material, but new material that I feel like illuminates in a very clear way what's been there for a long time. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, I appreciate your time.